I'm Max Keiser. Welcome to the Keiser Report. You want the latest Max Keiser news? I got a book coming out of my quotes. I've got a piece coming out in Bitcoin Magazine, and we're doing a show in El Salvador at El Zonte at Bitcoin Beach. Follow me on Twitter, Max Keiser, Maxkeiser. The address is right on the chyron, right under my face. Stacy.
Hey, it's nice to see you.
What's happening? Oh.
Hey, you know what? While you boast about yourself, I'm going to boast a little bit about myself as well, because here is a photo of me, and I had the chance to pose with U.S. monetary policy right here.
Oh, it's Queen Stacy.
Yes.
Oh, that looks like a central bank on fire.
That is the economy, the financial system, the fiscal system, everything is just on fire, right?
What a meme.
Our dollar, everything is on fire. So yes, that's what's called a meme. And this meme is going to say, it turns out this week that first of all, we have the tragedy of the treadmill. But before we get to that, I want to show you the evidence that Bitcoin is all about peace, because it is the language of diplomacy. Remember, it used to be French that was considered the language of diplomacy. Now it is Bitcoin. And we have the evidence of that with Joe Biden's own statement, the administration's statement regarding this. New York Times reports that the Biden administration warned that digital currencies posed a threat to America's sanctions program, and said in a new report that the U.S. needed to modernize how sanctions were deployed so that they remained an effective national security tool. Basically, Bitcoin forces diplomacy, right? Because if you were the only nation in the world with one nuclear bomb that you can kill everybody else, there's no mutually assured destruction in that situation, right? So everybody abides by whatever, they obey whatever you command. So we have mutually assured destruction in the nuclear weapons programs around the world. So that's why we have fewer wars between great powers. But here we've had the sole superpower in terms of the fiat currency, the settlement layer. And now Bitcoin makes that so that they have to go to the negotiating table. They have to deal because sanctions no longer work.
Well, right. Mutually assured destruction on the atomic weapons is an example of game theory in action with kinetic weaponry. We've never had it in finance before. And now we do with Bitcoin. And we see the game theory kicking in. And the game theory favors peace over war. So sanctions are being avoided by Bitcoin because nations are simply doing an end run around the dollar to settle. So with Bitcoin, the transaction is the settlement. You don't need a third party. And it's up and running for 12 years. It's guaranteed it's going to work. So this is similar to outlawing other forms of warfare. You know, sanctions, it's a declaration of war. Other forms of warfare could be dropping a bomb, for example. You know, America is the only country in the world that can drop a bomb on any other country in the world and get away with it. And no one really questions it. So that's an asymmetric relationship between one country and the rest of the world. So with Bitcoin, you're removing America's place as quote unquote sole superpower, and you're ceding to a new world order of equanimity and diplomacy, because you cannot take somebody's Bitcoin. It's unconfiscatable. You can only acquire more Bitcoin by offering an open hand and something in exchange that will be accepted in exchange for Bitcoin.
Well, clearly the Biden administration is conceding the fact that Bitcoin is neutral for real. It can't be one party cannot gain control over it. Thus, they're saying, and the headline from the Wall Street Journal read, Biden administration trim use of sanctions in a foreign policy shift. So they concede defeat. They're saying we can't use this anymore. And in particular, they mentioned that many foreign governments, including some allies, have often criticized the U.S. use as bad policy and long-arm justice. Sanctions advocates have also questioned their effectiveness and, quote, worried about undermining U.S. global power and spurring the creation of alternative financial systems and the use of cryptocurrencies beyond U.S. reach. Regardless of like war and all that sort of stuff, we pointed this out back in 2009, 2010, when Obama took Iran off the SWIFT system. We said alternatives would emerge. The Wall Street Journal, well, the Biden administration is now conceding that we were right, that Keiser Report was right. 10 years ago, we got it right.
Yeah, and it also applies down to the level of anti-sanction or anti-censorship for payments. And we saw that in the Julian Assange case, in other cases where the payments companies like PayPal and Visa and MasterCard censor transactions for political ends. And have removed themselves from the neutrality that they should be, just facilitating payments. Now they're being disintermediated as well. Even Peter Thiel, who was one of the founders of PayPal, has come out last week and said, I really feel underinvested in Bitcoin, and I really think that this is the future. So you see that tectonic shift now away from the legacy payment rail systems to this uncensorable, unconfiscatable, perfect money called Bitcoin.
Right. So, I mean, we see how the U.S. dollar is here, here I was again, posing in front of that monetary policy and all the problems it causes. Like, this is the Keiser Report, essentially, the Triffin dilemma, the Thucydides trap. All of these things are caused by this. All of the wealth and income gap caused by this. This is the photo that caused it all.
Oh, wow.
The meme that caused it all. But, in terms of these shortages that are happening in this world that was set up, the world set up by the US dollar, all fiat system is this. That's it. And we'll show you some more evidence of this. Psaki jokes the supply chain crisis is the tragedy of the delayed treadmill. Press secretary is accused of downplaying a scandal that has prompted White House to consider sending in the National Guard. The National Guard may be sent in to help offload containers to deliver, consumer goods. But the thing is, we're also seeing, ratcheting up prices, jumping prices of gasoline, energy, food prices. Whether or not we get food shortages, we'll see.
Right. Inflation's been a problem for many years, but the administration used a bald-faced lie to hide the fact. They actually used the term deflation to refer to inflation. And then prices got out of control, and you can't hide it anymore. They said it was transitory. That's a lie, as we said on this show. It's now structural and systemic and secular. It's going to be with us for a number of years. I also said that the language would become obtuse, and there would be much pretzel logic, as I called it, to describe all the contortions. They would use verbal contortions to try to get people to either deflect away from the fact that there's this runaway inflation, or to try to describe it in a way that somehow makes sense to their demented minds, in this case, literally demented minds. And so they've come up with a phrase called the treadmill. What is it called?
It's the delayed treadmill.
The delayed treadmill. Okay, a delayed treadmill. Think about it. Those are two words, you put them together, and they absolutely make no sense. As I warned you, as I told you many weeks ago, that the language would get more off the charts ridiculous. So delayed treadmill, to describe the problems of inflation that were predictable given the money printing and price signal destruction through market manipulation. Where are we going to go with this undermining of language and destruction of language?
I will tell you, again, this meme, this is the economy, this is the financial system, this is the monetary system on fire. The treadmill, think of one, a metaphor we've used often, the Red Queen syndrome. You have to run harder and harder, faster and faster to stay in the same place. That was the setup with the 0% interest rates. You have to print harder and harder and faster just to stay in the same place. More and more debt to have the same number of GDP growth. More and more drilling of fracking to get the same amount of oil that used to just put a straw in the ground and it would pop out. More and more jobs. With inflation, you have to have 2, 3, 4 jobs, or more and more stimulus checks, all sorts of credits and stimulus checks and programs and policies to keep on getting money into
Right. So a more accurate description would be the fatal treadmill, that you're running on a treadmill to death. The Red Queen syndrome in the story, Alice in Wonderland, it's a metaphor for the hopelessness and existential angst that comes with modernity. But the Red Queen didn't die on the treadmill, whereas America is going to die on the fatal treadmill brought on by money printing that many have warned about, but they won't say money printing.
Well, I even have, if you look closely, I have a crown on in this meme. So that is foretelling the Red Queen syndrome. It's telling you this picture tells 1,000 words. 1,000 episodes of Keiser Report are contained.
This is the Rosetta Stone of memes and Keiser Report. Understanding this meme with Stacy wearing a crown. I don't know if you've seen it close enough or not, but that's Stacy wearing a crown in front of a burning building. This is the key meme of all memes. This is deconstructing all you need to know about our modern life in this meme.
So I also want to turn to, this inflationary mindset. We brought it up almost a year ago, that once it sets in the mind of the population, then you start seeing the rapidly escalating inflation numbers because people start demanding higher salaries, they start consuming faster. You get thousands of tankers of container ships stuck outside the Long Beach port. These things are part of that whole mentality of the mindset of inflationary thing. So in terms of this, that was supposed to be transitory, is obviously becoming permanent. The supply chain problems are supposed to be transitory. They could be permanent. If you look at the Washington Post, one of the papers that all the Washington, D.C. elite abide by, here's their opinion piece about the supply chain problems. Don't rant about short-staffed stores and supply chain woes. All I can do is hope for the best, like everybody else, and keep those expectations reasonable. Eventually, the supply chain will get straightened out. American consumers might have been spoiled, but generations of them have also dealt with shortages of some kind: gasoline in the 70s, food rationing in the 40s, housing in the 20s, when cities such as Detroit were booming. Now it's our turn to make adjustments. So have lower expectations, Max.
Well, having lower expectations, that's very Jimmy Carter-like. I remember during the 70s, he asked people to deal with the malaise that had set in America's life. And this gave rise to the Reagan-Thatcher era shortly thereafter, because people were unwilling to hit the brake in any way. So I think similarly, we may see this moment of pause followed by rapid nationalization and hyper-capitalization and neoliberalism, an attempt there anyway. But of course, China might have another opinion.
I think Bitcoin has another opinion, and it's too late to adopt any other ism.
Yeah, Bitcoin is the last ism. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. Hey, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Charles Hugh Smith. He's got a website called of2minds.com. It's a must-read. Charles, welcome back.
Thank you, Max. Always my pleasure.
Now, in a low-key kind of way, you've become the oracle of Hawaii. Your predictions have all come true. Supply chains are breaking down as you predicted. Long before the pandemic, but now there's an actual crisis. What do the supply chain issues we are seeing everywhere tell us about the economy, Charles?
Okay, Max, well, that's a great question. And I guess my answer is that what I bring to the table is like trying to look at things as a system, right? And so then you look at how is the system structured? And is that going to be a resilient system or is it going to be a fragile system? And so if you're going to set maximizing profit as the sole organization goal of your system, then you're going to end up with a fragile system, which is why we have what we have. And so, in other words, to maximize profit, you end up with one supplier of certain components. And then when that supplier gets trashed or shut down for whatever reason, then the dominoes start falling all the way from that one supplier near Fukushima, Japan, all the way to the local Walmart.
Right. So it's the problem of having oligopolies or monopolies. And without competition, you end up with fragility in the system. And when it breaks catastrophically. And the time to take to rebuild the competitive element of this economy, we're talking decades. And in the meantime, looks like we're in for some tough times. Now, nearly 2 years into the global pandemic, shortages are getting worse, not better. The White House calls it the tragedy of the delayed treadmill, which is one of the most awkward phrases I've ever read coming out of the White House. Usually they're a bit more poetic than that. And yet the administration is also sending in the National Guard to help out. What happens if we get actual shortages of food and gasoline, Charles?
Yeah, exactly. And those of us who are a little long in tooth remember the gas crisis of 1973, where there were long lines and a panic, and then the oil gas shortage of 1979. So America has had these sort of short-term crises, but what I think we're totally unprepared for is a long-term crisis of scarcity. That's systemic. It's not just like, oh, well, we can, shuck and jive our way through this, and in 10 weeks, it's all going to be fixed. No, that's not the situation we have. So as to your point, if you set up a system of oligarchies controlling everything to maximize their own private gain, then you strip out all the redundancy and resilience out of your supply chains. It's going to take quite an effort to rebuild those from the ground up.
Yeah, the incentive in the 1970s crisis from the Middle Eastern countries was essentially just extortion, and there was an end game. They were going to choke the system until they got their money. Here, it's different in that systemically, the system is breaking apart. And not because somebody purposefully tried to extort anybody, but because it was extremely fragile and it couldn't withstand the kind of shock that we had in COVID. And now we've got this, as you say, systemic problems, also leading into chip shortages or hitting manufacturing. According to Yahoo Finance, there are only 20,000 tons of copper left on the London Metal Exchange, which is about what China uses in one day. So here's like another dimension to this. You've got the London Metals Exchange talking about actually running out of copper, that market hitting market failure. Unfortunately, these things never seem to happen to gold. We would love gold to hit market failure years ago, so get the price higher, but for some reason that never happens in gold, but it is happening in copper, Charles.
Right. And so I think we have to look at one of the big changes that's happened is, China's emergence as the largest economy in the world by, some measures, certainly equal to the U.S. by any measure. And the problem here is that China's economy is incredibly dependent on building new high rises, new residential towers by the hundreds or thousands. And of course, these massive developments use a huge amount of concrete and copper and iron and all those kind of resources. And so if you're building like 70 million units every year or two, you're going to dominate the global supply chains, right? And so China's kind of put the world in a vice as well as their own economies, because if they stop building those tens of millions of units, their economy falters. And then you get a supply chain shock of suddenly there's reduced demand and then the price craters, and then producers can't make a profit. So they just let the copper ore sit there in the mine, right? If you can't make a profit, then you're not going to produce the copper. And so then you get a shortage from a collapse of price.
Right. I guess to put this into perspective, China is incredibly reliant on the property sector for GDP growth. In the U.S., in Russia, for example, I think 12 to 15% of GDP is energy related. In the United States, up to 20% of GDP is healthcare related. America is essentially a hospital disguised as a country. Now, with China, you've got over a third of the entire GDP is related to property, real estate, financial activity that goes along with that. And we're hearing a lot of things happening in China, Evergrande, for example. And there's two schools of thought, that this is going to be a local contained issue, or it could be another Lehman moment, global contagion. You're so far west in the United States, you're actually close to the east. I'm sure as you can see China from your window. That's how far west you are in America. So is there any validity to this, Charles?
Well, Max, I have visited China from the year 2000 on, so I have a little bit of personal history, and we have a lot of, Chinese friends with experience in their economy and their state. So I have a little bit of perspective. I'm not an expert. I don't read Mandarin, but I can say that I see President Xi's effort to kind of orient the Chinese economy as profoundly correct. In other words, his reading of it is, hey, these asymmetries and imbalances are not healthy for China's long-term future, and so he's trying to kind of correct the course of the economy by trying to shrink the real estate section, and also put a collar on the tech oligarchs, which he rightly perceives as threats to the Communist Party's control. So he's trying to course correct here, but it's going to be difficult because when you allow your economy to become dependent on one sector, when that sector has to shrink, then your whole economy is going to shrink too. And of course, here in the U.S., as you say, sick care is 20% of the economy, and that if the idea that would have to shrink to right the ship here in the U.S. is impossible. So China has the advantage of a leadership that can be decisive, where we're so enthralled to oligarchies that we're just stuck in the mud. We can't seem to change in any systemic fashion.
Right. For the U.S. economy to get better, there has to be a large percentage of the population that actually gets healthy, and that's not likely. A good point. So you've, for years, talked about localization as a solution, and we see pockets of that developing, but not a wholesale, wide-scale thought about people becoming more localized and self-sufficient, growing their own food, et cetera. What's the current thinking on that?
Well, that's a great topic, Max, and I'm glad you bring it up because, a lot of people, and myself included, talk about it, but it's all like, well, how does that actually happen? How do we make that happen? And of course, scarcity is a pretty good driver, because if you can't find any toilet paper or fresh apples or anything else in your local store, you might start wondering, well, gee, why don't we make that stuff here? And of course, we know the reason why we don't make anything here or grow any apples or that we used to in various places is the global supply chain said, hey, we can ship this same item 5,000 miles and we're going to make a dime more profit per pound or item. So we're going to do it. So then all the local supply chains atrophied, that you don't just have no more people growing food or no plants making toilet paper locally. You also have no distribution for it, right? All the distribution is set up to come through Long Beach from China or from Mexico or wherever. So in other words, the infrastructure that allowed for localization has atrophied in the U.S. And so you have to rebuild the whole supply chain. And of course, that also includes people, that when you lay off all those old guys that knew how to run the plant and all the elderly people that knew how to keep it going, then there's nobody, that knowledge has been lost. And so we also have that problem in the U.S.
Yeah, in China, getting back to China for a second, there's a quote laying flat movement where young people decide they would rather not work and just lay flat and play video games. In the stagflation of the 70s, when we talked about the 70s, people were desperate to work. Now there are 10 million jobs available, but no takers, right? So it's like a flip side of the 1970s. What about this labor shortage? The only solution seems to be that they're going to have to start paying people more money, Charles.
Max, it goes back to some of our first conversations we had in Paris in 2000, I don't know, 10 or 11, when you and I were talking about these large, from a Marxist perspective, and I think that it's really clear that labor has been degraded and diminished for at least 40 years, right? In other words, as you say, it's wages, but it's also working conditions, that the working conditions have become abominable and across the entire spectrum, from highly paid people being pressured to work, all the time, to the speeding up of fast food, production. Everything is now much more skewed against people working and the labor force. And it's all skewed to the benefit of the billionaires and the oligarchs. And so that is why I think there's laying flat in China and why there's the great resignation here in the US. People are just sick and tired of working longer and harder and getting less for their money and not getting any respect.
Yeah, no respect and no dignity, which in America
Yes.
is particularly dangerous because there's no cultural history. So in Europe, people might not be working, but they have a dignity in being part of a 100,000-year culture of which they're a part of. But in the U.S., of course, we don't have that. It's just either you're wealthy or you're a piece of garbage, essentially. But anyway, we're going to take a little hiatus until segment 2. But for now, thanks for being on Keiser Report.
Thank you so much, Max. It's always my pleasure.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our guest, Charles Hugh Smith of twominds.com is his website. Until next time, bye, y'all.